Imagine this. A young black woman, full of dreams and determination, walks into a courtroom, ready to face a system that's already decided her fate. But what she doesn't know is that the very people who orchestrated her downfall, the cops, who bribed a judge to frame her, are about to get the shock of their lives. Because today, the tables are turning. Today, she's not just the defendant, she's their new boss. This is a story about power, corruption, and the moment justice finally looks in the mirror and sees its own reflection. Buckle up, because this is one courtroom drama you won't forget. It all started in a small town where everyone knew everyone, but no one really knew the truth. The kind of place where the police department had more secrets than cases solved, and the judge's gavel seemed to echo with the sound of backroom deals. Enter Maya Johnson, a 28-year-old community organizer who had spent her life fighting for the underdog. She was the kind of person who believed in fairness, even when the world around her seemed anything but fair. But Maya had no idea that her activism had made her a target. The local cops, led by Sergeant Rick Harris, saw her as a threat, a loud, unapologetic voice that could expose the cracks in their corrupt system. And they weren't about to let that happen. It began with a traffic stop. Maya was pulled over for a broken taillight, or so they said. But when the officers searched her car, they found a bag of drugs tucked under the passenger seat. Maya knew it was a setup. She'd never touched drugs in her life, but before she could even process what was happening, she was arrested, charged and thrown into a legal nightmare. The evidence was flimsy, but the judge, a man named Harold Greer, seemed determined to make the charges stick. What Maya didn't know was that Greer had a history of working hand in hand with the police, and this time they'd paid him to ensure she'd be convicted. As the trial date approached, Maya felt the weight of the system pressing down on her. Her lawyer, a young public defender named Chris, did his best, but even he could see the odds were stacked against them. The prosecution had witnesses, cops who swore they'd seen Maya with the drugs. The judge seemed to dismiss every argument Chris made, and the media? They'd already painted Maya as a criminal. It felt like the whole town had turned against her. But Maya wasn't the type to give up. She knew she was innocent, and she was determined to prove it. What she didn't know was that fate had a twist in store, one that would change everything. The day of the trial arrived, and the courtroom was packed. Sergeant Harris sat in the back, smirking like he'd already won. Judge Greer took his seat, his face unreadable. Maya sat at the defendant's table, her heart pounding but her head held high. Chris leaned over and whispered, "We've got this." But even he didn't sound convinced. The prosecution presented its case, painting Maya as a dangerous drug dealer. The cops testified, their stories rehearsed and polished. It felt like a done deal. But then, just as the judge was about to call for a recess, the door at the back of the courtroom swung open. Everyone turned to see a woman in a sharp suit walking in, her heels clicking against the floor. She had an air of authority that made the room go silent. Judge Greer's eyes widened. Sergeant Harris froze. Even Maya was confused. Who was this woman? The stranger walked straight to the front of the room, handed a piece of paper to the bailiff, and turned to face the court. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady but firm, "I'm here to take over this case." The room erupted in whispers. Judge Greer looked at the paper, his face turning pale. He cleared his throat and said, "It appears we have a new presiding judge." And then he dropped the bombshell. "This is Judge Maya Johnson." The room went dead silent. Maya's jaw dropped. Sergeant Harris looked like he'd seen a ghost. Even Chris was speechless, because the woman standing before them wasn't just any judge. She was Maya's older sister, a woman who'd left town years ago to pursue a career in law, and had just been appointed to the bench. And she wasn't just here to oversee the case. She was here to clean house. The look on Sergeant Harris's face said it all. They'd messed with the wrong family. But as the new judge took her seat, Maya couldn't help but wonder, what did this mean for her case? Would her sister be able to stay impartial? Or was this the moment the system finally started to crumble? The tension in the room was palpable. Judge Johnson, Maya's sister, looked around the courtroom, her eyes landing on Sergeant Harris, then on Judge Greer. There was a flicker of something in her gaze, anger, determination, maybe even a hint of satisfaction. She picked up the gavel, and for a moment, it felt like the whole world was holding its breath. "This court is now in session," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife. And with those words, the battle for justice began. But as the first witness was called, one question hung in the air, unanswered. In a town where corruption ran deep, could one woman, even a judge, really make a difference? Or was this just the beginning of a fight that would change everything? Stay tuned, because this story is far from over. The courtroom was electric with tension as Judge Maya Johnson, now presiding over the case, settled into her seat. Her presence was like a storm rolling in, quiet but impossible to ignore. Everyone in the room could feel the shift in power, but no one knew what it meant yet. For Maya, the defendant, it was a surreal moment. Her sister, the woman she hadn't seen in years, was now the one holding her fate in her hands. For Sergeant Harris and Judge Greer, it was a nightmare they hadn't seen coming. They had planned everything so carefully, but this was a wild card they hadn't accounted for. Judge Johnson wasted no time. She called the court to order and immediately addressed the prosecution. "Counselor," she said, her voice calm, but firm, "I've reviewed the case file, and I have some concerns about the evidence presented, specifically the chain of custody for the alleged drugs found in the defendant's vehicle. Can you clarify how this evidence was handled?" The prosecutor, a man named David Collins, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He wasn't used to being questioned so directly, especially not by a judge who had just walked into the courtroom. "Your Honor," he began, "the evidence was collected by Officer Harris and logged into the system according to standard procedure." Judge Johnson raised an eyebrow. "Standard procedure, and yet there's no body camera footage to corroborate this. Why is that?" Collins hesitated. "The officers involved reported a malfunction with their equipment that day. Maya's lawyer, Chris, seized the opportunity." "Your Honor, if I may," he said, standing up. "The lack of body camera footage, combined with the questionable circumstances of the traffic stop, raises serious doubts about the integrity of this case. I move to have the evidence dismissed." Judge Johnson leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. "I'll take that under advisement," she said. "But for now, let's proceed. Officer Harris, you're up next." Sergeant Harris stood, his face a mask of confidence, but Maya could see the faintest flicker of unease in his eyes. He took the stand, swore to tell the truth, and prepared to deliver the same rehearsed testimony he'd given a dozen times before. But Judge Johnson wasn't having it. "Officer Harris," she began, her tone sharp, "you claim to have found the drugs in question during a routine traffic stop. Yet the defendant has no prior criminal record, and there's no evidence linking her to drug activity. Can you explain why you chose to search her vehicle?" Harris cleared his throat. "Your Honor, I observed suspicious behavior from the defendant. She appeared nervous and was avoiding eye contact, which led me to believe she might be hiding something." Judge Johnson nodded slowly, as if considering his words. "I see. And yet the broken taillight, the reason for the stop, was never documented in your initial report. Why is that?" Harris hesitated. It must have been an oversight, Your Honor." The room was silent, the tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. Maya could feel her heart pounding in her chest. Her sister was dismantling the prosecution's case piece by piece, but it wasn't over yet. Judge Johnson turned to Chris. "Counselor, do you have any further questions for the witness?" Chris stood, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "Yes, Your Honor. Officer Harris, you mentioned that the defendant appeared nervous. Isn't it true that many people feel anxious during a traffic stop, especially when confronted by multiple officers?" Harris shifted in his seat. "I suppose that's possible," he admitted. "But in my experience, that level of nervousness usually indicates guilt." Chris pressed on. "Or it could indicate fear, couldn't it? Fear of being targeted by law enforcement, for example." Harris didn't answer, but the look on his face said it all. As the questioning continued, Maya couldn't help but think about how she'd ended up here. It had all started with her work in the community. She'd been organizing protests, speaking out against police brutality, and demanding accountability from local leaders. She'd known it would make her a target, but she never imagined it would go this far. The cops had tried to intimidate her before, following her car, showing up at her events, even leaving threatening notes on her doorstep. But this was a whole new level. They weren't just trying to silence her, they were trying to destroy her. And they'd almost succeeded. But now, with her sister in the judge's seat, Maya felt a glimmer of hope. She didn't know how much her sister could do, or how far she was willing to go. But for the first time since this nightmare began, she felt like she had a fighting chance. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was going on. Why had the cops gone to such lengths to frame her? What were they so afraid of? And what did Judge Greer have to gain from helping them? The questions swirled in her mind, but there were no answers. Not yet. Back in the courtroom, Judge Johnson was wrapping up her questioning of Sergeant Harris. "One last thing, officer," she said, her voice icy. "You testified that the drugs were found under the passenger seat of the defendant's vehicle. Yet the forensic report indicates that the bag contained no fingerprints, not even yours. How do you explain that?" Harris opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The room was silent, waiting for his answer, but it never came. Judge Johnson leaned forward, her gaze piercing. "I'll take your silence as an admission that you can't explain it. Counselor," she said, turning to Chris, "you may proceed." Chris didn't waste any time. He called Maya to the stand, and for the first time, she had a chance to tell her side of the story. She spoke about the traffic stop, the search, the arrest, everything. She talked about her work in the community, the threats she'd received, and her belief that this case was nothing more than a setup. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the witness stand. When she finished, Chris turned to Judge Johnson. "Your Honor, based on the evidence, or lack thereof, and the testimony we've heard today, I move to have all charges against my client dismissed." Judge Johnson didn't respond right away. She looked at Maya, then at Sergeant Harris, then at Judge Greer, who had been sitting silently at the side of the room. The weight of her decision hung in the air, and for a moment, it felt like time had stopped. Finally, she spoke. "I'll need some time to review the evidence and consider the arguments presented. Court is adjourned until tomorrow morning." She banged the gavel, and just like that, it was over. For now. As Maya left the courtroom, she felt a mix of relief and anxiety. She'd made it through the first day, but the fight was far from over. Her sister's arrival had changed everything, but it had also raised new questions. What would happen if the charges were dismissed? Would the cops try something else? And what about Judge Greer? He'd been quiet during the proceedings, but Maya could feel his presence like a shadow hanging over the room. She didn't know what he was planning, but she knew one thing. He wasn't going to let this go without a fight. Outside the courthouse, the media was waiting. Cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions, but Maya kept her head down and pushed through the crowd. Chris was by her side, guiding her to his car. "We'll figure this out," he said, his voice steady. "But for now, just stay strong." Maya nodded, but her mind was racing. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew one thing. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about justice, real justice, and she wasn't going to stop until she got it. The question was, would the system let her, or would it crush her like it had so many others? Only time would tell.